Welcome. I'm Clara Carroll, National Board Certified Teacher from Arkansas, and I get the privilege of introducing Wes Moore. As readers of his best-selling book, The Other Wes Moore, know that Wes Moore was a child of a single mother and a troubled childhood. He was on academic disciplinary probation by the time he was 8 and 9 years old, and when he was 11 was the first time he had felt handcuffs on his wrist. But with the help of many mentors, especially his grandfather, he went on to Johns Hopkins University, earned a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, served as an Army officer in Afghanistan, worked as a special assistant to Secretary Condoleezza Rice at the State Department as a White House Fellow, and worked at Wall Street. Now he writes about that journey, and we're excited to hear about what he has to say today. Let's welcome Wes Moore.
Good afternoon. I am so excited to be here. Seriously, I mean, it really does make my day. First of all, just see dear friends like Lisa. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm not sure, and Joe Manco, who I've long not just admired and stalked for so long because of his commitment to his students, but it's really important for me to be here just to come say thank you, first of all, and because I have such a huge and deep admiration for who you are and what you do. I remember when I first came back from Afghanistan. This was back in the second time, 2006, and there were a group of people who were there, like at the tarmac, who were there to welcome our unit back. I was with the 82nd Airborne Division, and they were just coming back just to say thanking us for our service and welcoming us back home. And I remember there was one group of people who were there who I started a conversation with, and they were teachers. And the only thing that I could think to say back to them was thank you for your service. Because the truth is that every single challenge and every single opportunity that we have in this country, we're never going to be able to approach every single opportunity with a Kevlar or a flak vest or an M4 rifle. And I say that as a very, very proud military veteran who takes my service in that realm very seriously. But the truth is that the best way that we're going to protect our country is by making sure that everybody within the country is part of a bigger conversation. That the best way we're really going to truly protect opportunity and hope and freedom is by making sure that everybody feels that there's a place for them in this world as well. That's the best way to do it. By making sure that everybody feels that this conversation includes them. That's why I say thank you for your service so sincerely as well, because this work matters. And for those who know, I have a very love-hate relationship with statistics. And for all you math teachers, not specifically about like what you do, but because I really think I have more of a quantitative mind than a qualitative mind. I really enjoy numbers and data and stats, but I do have a love-hate relationship with them because I know that oftentimes statistics and data can be used not just to add context, but they can be used to numb. They can be used to make people think that the problem is just too big for any of us to figure out. They can be used to make us feel like there's nothing that we can do. They can be used to make us feel that no matter how hard we try, the problem is just so large, so it actually makes more sense just to stop trying and doing something else. And I just know that to be not just inaccurate, but intellectually dishonest and morally damaging. Because every single one of us knows in our own hearts and in our own experiences what it's like to feel like that the world is not talking to you at a certain moment or a certain time. And unfortunately, if we have a larger collection and too large of a collection of our young people who feel that that's the case, that the burdens can sometimes be too heavy for their small shoulders. What happened to me wasn't simply being physically moved or physically transported. What happened to me was that I found myself surrounded by people. People who helped me to understand that the world is bigger than what was just directly in front of me. People who helped me to understand that we live in a big and a beautiful and a bright world and that I actually had a place in that world. People who helped me to get that there was never going to be a single accident of birth, not being black, not being poor, not being from Baltimore, not being from the Bronx, and not being fatherless, that was ever going to define me or that was ever going to limit me. And so in essence, what they did was they taught me what it meant to be free. That's what education does. You as teachers don't focus on giving degrees. You focus on giving freedom. You don't focus on just giving diplomas or grades. You focus on making sure that every single child feels that this world has a place for them as well. That's why I'm here to thank you. Because I know had it not been for that in my life, I know how different those circumstances could have made things. And so when people talk about, it's really wonderful because, I know some of the themes of this conference have been about on this larger theme of things like equity and how do we create equitable conversations amongst our young people. And there's a couple things that I hope I can just speak to briefly that'll hopefully just add a sense of context to that conversation as well. When I was 3.5 years old, and so I only have 2 real memories of my father. And the first memory I have of my father was when I was about 3.5 at that time. And my mother had a bunch of rules in her house, but one of her big rules was that men do not put their hands on women. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized the reason that she was so insistent on that rule is because of her own personal past, her own personal background. So she always said, I will never tolerate it if I see it. And I especially will not tolerate it if I see it in my son. But I have an older sister who's like 6 years older than me. And I have a younger sister who's like a year younger than me. And me and my older sister, we used to get in like drag-out brawls. Like huge, like steel cage match kind of fights, right? And my mother, every time she'd see us fighting, she'd always come up to me. She's like, you do not put your hands on women. You do not put your hands on women. And I have to explain to my mother and say, but Mommy, this is not a woman. This is Nikki. This is different. But my mother didn't see the difference between the two. And one time I was sitting there and I was minding my own business. Nikki comes up to me and she starts blowing in my face like, blowing my face. I told her to stop. She wouldn't stop. She gets up and she runs away and I get up and I run after her. And finally when I caught her, I cocked my fist back and I punched her. And as soon as I connected, I turned around and I saw my mom. So I knew it was about to get real bad real quick, right? So Mom starts coming after me. I start running the other direction. And I run upstairs, and we had a small house, but we had my bedroom was a closet that they converted into a bedroom after my baby sister was born. So in this room was a bed for me, small bed for me, and a crib for my baby sister, and that was all that was in this room. And I'm running around this room trying to find a place to hide, and there is no place to hide in this room. And finally, I kind of like just sit down in the corner of the bed because I heard footsteps, and I kind of like get myself mentally prepared for what's about to happen to me, right? And then when I hear like a knock on the door, and then my dad comes into the room. And when he comes into the room, he sits down on the bed next to me, and he picks me up and puts me on his lap. And then he starts explaining to me what I'd done so wrong and why my job is to protect women and not to hit them, why my job is to protect my family and not to go after them. And then he told me that I needed to go downstairs to go apologize to my mother and to my sister, but he told me that he would come with me. And I remember as we were walking down the stairs together, how I was holding on to his hand and literally my entire hand wrapped around his finger. And he had this really funny way of walking because when he walked downstairs, he stuck his chest out. And so I'm like 3.5 years old and I'm sticking my chest out, walking next to him, because everything I ever wanted to be was to be him. And the only other memory that I have of him was about 6 months later when I watched him die. And as tough as I thought I had it, or as tough as I thought my sisters had it, the person who really had it toughest was my mom. Because now here she was, a widow in her late 20s that was now going to raise these 3 kids on her own. And in no way was this a life that she had expected or the life that she had prepared for. And she was having a really difficult time after he died. My mom called up her parents, my grandparents, who lived up in the Bronx in New York. And my grandfather was a minister in the South Bronx, and my grandmother was a public school teacher for 27 years in the South Bronx. And their house was barely big enough for them, but they figured out a way to make it big enough for all of us. And we made this move up to New York. And the reason I bring up that story is because when I first moved up there, I found myself getting very lost very quickly. I was hurting people that actually did love me so I could impress people that could care less about me. Started picking and choosing which days were worthwhile to go to school, and by the time I was 8 years old, I was first on probation, and that status kind of stuck with me for a while. And by the time I was 13 years old, my mom, after threatening me with military school, I found out that when she makes threats that she's not playing. Because when I was 13, she decided to send me away to this school. And I remember the first 5 days there, because I would let anyone know who would listen to me that there's no point in you wasting your time on me because I'm not staying. I mean, literally in the first 4 days, I'd already run away 5 times from the school. They had these big black gates that surround the school. Every time they would turn their back, they would always tell us, they'd scream at us all the time. They'd be like, if y'all don't like it here, there's a train station right in Wayne, you can go home anytime you want. And so every time they would turn their backs, I would just take them up on their offer and run to the train station, but I kept on getting lost on the way to the train station. And finally, after the 5th time I ran away, I was sitting down in a chair, and my whole chain of command, who were the students in charge, they were standing behind me. And I remember looking over my shoulder, yo, stop looking at me, stop looking at me. I was just so angry. And I looked over my right shoulder, and I was like, yo, stop looking. And I saw this guy who I had never seen before. This dude was like African-American, 5'11", like 230 pounds, like no neck, all muscles, like one of these dudes, right? And I remember looking over my shoulder, like, yo, stop looking. And I kind of looked straight, and I got quiet because he was kind of big, and I didn't know what he was going to do to me. But he never said a word to me. He never said a word. He just stood there, and he looked at me. And after they kind of did their thing with me, and they sent me back up to my room, and I went to bed that night just as angry as I went to bed the night before, I remember going up and the next morning in formation, and I'm staying in attention. And I saw him talking with my TAC officer, who's one of the adults in charge. And I knew they were talking about me because he was pointing at me. But I was staying in attention, so I wasn't supposed to be seeing this. But I'm looking out of the corner of my eye, I'm like, yo, why does this dude keep looking at me? And I saw him take a step back and salute my TAC officer. My TAC officer saluted him back. And I saw him then start walking over to F Company, which is the college guys, the older cadets. And as he walked over to F Company, I just assumed that he would fall into the back of the formation. And as he walked over, I heard someone yell, company, attention, whoop! And then 150 guys all at once just cracked to attention. And he kept on walking. And he walked to the front of the formation. And the person I thought was in charge saluted him. And he saluted back, and the person I thought was in charge then went to the back of the formation. So I'm watching this guy out of the corner of my eye, and I'm thinking to myself, that dude is in charge. I had never seen anything like that before. I had never seen a person demand that kind of attention and respect simply because he walked into their presence. Demand that kind of admiration simply because he walked into a room. And I remember watching that and thinking about so many of these guys who I looked up to and admired and all that kind of stuff for all the wrong reasons I was talking about before. And I remember at that moment, I began thinking to myself, those guys look real small right now. He gave me a chance to see something that I had never seen before. He gave me a chance to see a little bit of myself and to actually have a bigger sense of belief of what I actually could accomplish if I actually started believing in myself a little bit more. One of the first components of establishing equity is establishing example. Is having all of our young people understand what's actually possible in their lives. Because whether we realize it or not, we're being studied. We're being watched. We're being followed. One of the things, I love working with young people. In fact, some of y'all have been to your classes, which makes me very excited. But one thing I always love sharing with all the students that we work with is, on this idea of role modeling, is whether you realize it or not, you're already a role model. People are watching you. They're watching how you walk. They're watching how you talk. They're watching how you interact. They're watching what you say and they're modeling. One of the first components that we have to be able to embrace when we're talking about this bigger conversation of equity is example. One of the other components that we have to be able to wrap our arms around is this component of expectation. So the book we were speaking about earlier was this book called The Other Wes Moore, and it's a book that I wrote partially about how the day after I received the Rhodes Scholarship, the Baltimore Sun, which is my hometown paper, wrote this article about my life. And they talked about a little bit about what the Rhodes Scholarship was, and they talked about how this local kid who had some challenges and things I was going through as I was coming up was now getting ready to head overseas with these 31 other American students to go study in Oxford. At the same time, the Baltimore Sun was writing a whole series of articles about these 4 guys who one day walked into a jewelry store. And these 4 guys, when they walked, the first 2 walked in the jewelry store, and they reached in their coats and they pulled out guns, and they cocked the guns back, and they started pointing the guns at everybody inside the store and telling everybody to get on the ground and keep their hands on top of their heads. And everybody who was inside the store got on the ground and put their hands on their heads like they were told to. And then 10 seconds later, 2 other guys walked in the store, and when they walked in the store, they reached in their coats and they pulled out mallets. And one guy with a gun, one guy with a mallet went to the left, one guy with a gun, one guy with a mallet went to the right. The ones with the guns were keeping everybody on the ground, while the ones with the mallets were walking around and just smashing out jewelry cases and taking out watches and rings and necklaces. The 4 guys met in the back of the store with a little over $400,000 worth of jewelry. One of them yelled, "Let's go," and then all 4 guys then ran out of the center of the store and then ran outside to the adjacent parking lot. And one of the people that was inside the store that day was an off-duty police officer. He was a 13-year veteran of the Baltimore Police Force. He was a 3-time recipient of Police Officer of the Year. He was also a father of 5 who had just had triplets. And the reason he was in the store that day was because he took on a second job as a security guard to make extra money for his family. And he got up off the ground and he drew his weapon and he ran outside to see if he could stop the guys from getting away. And when he ran outside, he started kneeling next to cars and vehicles to give himself cover. But he didn't realize that one of the cars that he was kneeling next to was one of the cars that the guys were in. And one of the guys rolled the window down, and they shot him 3 times at point-blank range, and they killed him instantly. There was a 12-day national manhunt for those 4 guys, and finally after 12 days, all 4 guys were caught. And one of the people that the police were looking for that was eventually captured and tried and convicted and sentenced for the crime was this guy whose name was also Wes Moore. And the more I learned about him, and the more I learned about this crime, and the more I learned about this tragedy, the more I realized how much more we had in common than just our names. The fact that we were living in the same city at that time, literally blocks away from each other. We both were around the same age, both grew up in single-parent households, both had academic and disciplinary troubles, etc. And there were questions I wanted to ask, and he was the only one that could answer them. So one day I just decided to write him a note. And literally the first note that I wrote him was like, "Hey Wes, my name is Wes. Here's how I heard about you." And then about a month later, I got a letter back from Jessup Correctional Institution from Wes Moore. And to be honest, it'd be one thing if the letter that I would have gotten back from Wes, if it was like he wrote it in crayon or magic marker, or he wrote it with his whole hand or something, or instead of using words, if he used pictures. Because if that's a letter that I would have gotten back from him, I probably would have looked at that letter and said to myself, I guess I get it. This makes sense. And I probably would have moved on. The problem is I've never received that letter from him. The problem is the letter that I did receive from him was one of the most interesting and articulate letters that I've ever received in my life. And it only led to more questions. And that one letter turned into dozens of letters. Those dozens of letters turned into dozens of visits. And now I've known Wes for close to a decade. And during one of those conversations that I've had with Wes, and Wes is now in year 14 of a life sentence. Him, his older brother, and the 2 other people who were there that day all received life without parole because all 4 were found guilty of felony murder. But I remember during one conversation I was having with him, I'd always heard the expression growing up that people are products of their environments. I heard it so many times I never even questioned it anymore. One of my favorite hip-hop artists when I was coming out was a guy named Gang Starr, and he had this big song called Products of Our Environments. And then I asked Wes that question because we were talking about Baltimore, and I said, so do you think that we're products of our environments? And Wes looked back at me and he said, actually, I think we're products of our expectations. And I thought to myself, he is absolutely right. That we are not products of our environments. We're products of our expectations. And in fact, in many ways, when I hear people say, well, certain people are products of their environments, it makes me cringe because I know in essence what we're doing is we're essentially doing a Pontius Pilate, right? We are washing our hands of responsibility because that's where they're from, or that's who their family is, or that's the neighborhood that they come from, that somehow there's nothing that we can do about it. Which is not just wrong, it's intellectually dishonest. I know some people who were literally born in the gutter, who have done extraordinary things with their lives, and I know people who were born with every advantage known to man who have done absolutely nothing. It's more than just our environments. And someone once said to me, they said, it's a real shame that you lived up to your expectations and Wes didn't. And I said, actually, the real shame is that we both did. That's the real shame. Because the expectations that people have of themselves don't come from nowhere. The expectations that people have of themselves come from the expectations that other people have of them. And they just simply internalize them and they make them their own. I don't care if you're talking about the State House. I don't care if you're talking about Capitol Hill. I don't care if you're talking about military organizations, educational institutions, or state penitentiaries. All of them are full of people who lived up to their expectations. We have to be able to have an honest conversation about expectations if we're ever going to have an honest conversation about equity. Because part of the challenge is this. We can change every policy in the world. We can go up to Capitol Hill and state houses, and we can have bill after bill after bill that needs to be done to address education, and all those things will be incredibly important. But if there is not an expectation shift in the way that we think about all of our young people who are coming up, then those bills and changing them will be for naught. How we think about every one of our children matters. And that's why your work matters. I stand here because I had educators in my life, including my mother and my grandparents, because the truth is, education is never simply going to be the person who I meet when I walk into a classroom. It has to be a holistic experience that includes the family and the community as well. But I had educators in my life. People who helped me to understand that okay is not good enough. People who helped me to understand that I had a personal stake and responsibility in my own success as well. People who understood and internalized this idea that you are never doing me a favor by lowering my bar of expectation. You are never doing me a favor by telling me that I can't compete with someone. You are never doing me a favor by telling me because of things that I had to deal with when I was coming up that somehow I was any less prepared than anyone else to achieve. I'll paraphrase Booker T. Washington, and I think he said it incredibly well when he said, if you break a man's spirit, you do not have to show him where the back door is. He will walk there himself. What I had were educators in my life who helped me to understand that there was not going to be a single accident of birth that would ever define me. That's what they gave me. And that's what you give your students. You give them a pathway and help them to understand that the future is incredibly bright. You give them a way of understanding and appreciating that the things that that we look at as our greatest deficits are actually our greatest assets. I look at the things that I used to lean on when I was younger to make me say, well, I can't do X because I was born like this, or I can't do Y because this is my family situation, without realizing that every single one of us in our lives, we are going to see hurt. We're going to see tragedy. We're going to see things that will bother us. We're going to see things that are unfair. It is human nature. We've got to be prepared for it, and we've got to get over it. Every one of us, in some way, shape, or form, are going to see it. I know for a fact that because of the life that I have lived, there is nothing that I will ever see again that will make me flinch. I'm just not built that way anymore. That which I used to figure out and used to think was my greatest deficit is actually what I now believe is my greatest strength. When we see these things, I want people to my left and to my right who, when these things happen, are not going to curl up in a fetal position. But are going to keep moving. And keep moving with their head high. Your job as educators, our job as educators, is to help all kids understand and feel like there's a place for them as well. I'll close briefly. I remember I had something that my sister once told me, which has always kind of stuck with me, where she said her definition of hell would be one day God showing her everything she could have accomplished had she only tried. Her definition of hell would be one day God showing her everything she could have accomplished had she only tried. I'm a firm believer that we're not asked to do a whole lot during our time here. I'm a firm believer that we're asked to take care of each other. I'm a firm believer that we're asked to love. I'm a firm believer that, and I'm not trying to get religious, but it's my beliefs, but I'm a firm believer that if we're all supposed to be God's children, that means by definition, we're brothers and sisters. And we should actually act like it. I just want to make sure that with everything that we do, that when it's time to get that understanding of what we could have done had we only accomplished, that there's nothing left to say because we've accomplished and we've done everything we've ever been asked to do. I stand here because there were educators who believed in that. I stand here today because there are educators who actually helped me to understand that second chances do matter, that second chances do become last chances, but that it's important to embrace them when they're there. And they show me what true love is supposed to be all about. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your service. And thank you for making every day this place worth fighting for. Bless you guys, and thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Y'all are so sweet. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. And that means a lot, sincerely, especially coming from y'all. But if anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts or challenges or anything along those lines about the book, the future of education, anything along the work we're doing now with higher education, please, I would love to and be humbled and honored to answer any questions or have a conversation about that as well. And if anyone does, I'm just going to keep talking. Sorry. Yes.
Oh, never mind. They found the mic. Leave the DOG mic off.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to say, one of the things that struck me from the first book that you wrote was the comment that he couldn't believe they were so willing to write off a 12-year-old. And when I read that, it just kind of hit me and resonated, because sometimes, you know, when you're struggling with kids and you struggle with them and then the next grade teacher struggles with them and the next grade teacher struggles with them, it's hard to see how the trajectory of their life is going to change. But you help us to see that it's just very possible. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And you know, and so can you also see me if I stay here? Is that okay? All right, so I'm really glad you brought that up, because this idea that, you know, because I just believe as a larger society, we are far too quick to congratulate and far too quick to castigate. Right? I just feel like, oftentimes, and that's part of the reason why I really enjoy kind of telling the stories of the Wes Moore, because I always want to tell people, listen, if your takeaway from that story is there's a good Wes and a bad Wes, if your takeaway from that story that there's a good mom and a bad mom, if your takeaway from that story is one kid got sent away and the other kid didn't, then I would argue that not only did you miss the point, but you probably didn't even read the book. Right? And it's because, really what I wanted people to know, and you said in the piece, was that the chilling truth is that his story could have been mine. The tragedy is that my story could have been his. And that line that separates us is so unbelievably thin. It's decisions, it's moments in our lives that help us to go in one direction or a completely different direction. And we all have them. We all have those moments where it's like, man, had I done this, or those moments like, whew, that was a close call. We all have them. And so this idea where I was talking about this, where we are so quick to almost write off, and especially kids, becomes this, where I just feel like oftentimes what we are looking at is not necessarily a bad kid. But one thing I know that oftentimes for a lot of the kids that we're talking about, especially the ones where you're like, this is like, repeated and I'm trying, is that the only consistency that many kids have in their life is inconsistency. They've got people in and out of their lives all the time. I mean, whether it be family members or instructors or probation officers or whoever it is, in and out all the time. And so I kind of it makes me think about this, there's a poem by a guy named Paul Laurence Dunbar, and it's called We Wear the Mask. And it goes, we wear the mask that grins and lies, and it hides our teeth and it shades our eyes. This debt we pay for human guile, with bleeding and broken hearts we smile. And it continues on. But the whole poem and the framework and how I think about how it applies to our young kids is this, is we don't necessarily have bad kids. We've got kids who wake up every morning wearing the mask. And they put on the mask very intentionally, right? Because I think about it even in our own lives. If someone who you don't know or someone who you're not close to says something about you, do you really care? Like if someone writes something online about you, I have thick skin, so I kind of don't. But I don't care what someone writes in their grandmother's basement about me. I just don't. It doesn't move me, it doesn't bother me, it doesn't inspire me, it doesn't help me to think differently. But when someone who's really close to you does something that disappoints you or hurts you, that stings. And so if you don't want to be hurt, what then do? You keep the whole world at arm's reach, because if you're not close to me, then you can't hurt me. It's a defense mechanism. And so I feel like when we're watching so many kids, and I know I watch it even in myself, where I can run up a whole string of names of folks who, when I was 10 and 11 and 12 and 13 years old, already had defined what kind of adult that I was going to be if I was going to make it that far. And there is this idea that had I allowed them and had other people in my life allowed me to accept what they were saying, then they would have been right. But I had people in my life who would never give in to that and who would never let me give in to that. And that's why I stand here. So I think we don't just have a responsibility to them to make sure that we curb our judgment oftentimes when we're watching certain actions and try to dig a little deeper into what's happening and what's going on. But we have an obligation to our society. I have a very dear friend in Baltimore. We work with kids involved in the juvenile justice system. I have a very dear friend in Baltimore, and I was like, hey, do you mind spending 15 minutes? Just talk to our kids about what you do. He's a great engineer. Spend 15 minutes, just talk to your kids. Just tell them what you do. Like literally, just tell them about your day, because we want them to be exposed to different occupations and that kind of thing, right? And his response to me, and this was a few years back, but his response to me was, listen, I really appreciate what you guys are doing, but to be very honest with you, my community service is how I take care of my kids. And he is an extraordinary father. He really is. He's got 3 beautiful daughters. They're great kids, and he's great with them. And I told him I appreciated that. But I also told him, but listen, to be honest, how are you doing your daughters a favor when the neighborhood that they live in, they need to be home by a certain time because you're afraid for them to be out after that time? How are you doing your daughters a favor by when it comes time for them to choose a partner, when 61% of the young men in our neighborhood either have some form of interaction with either the juvenile or the adult prison system? How are you doing your kids a favor by doing that? So if we're not going to do it to be selfless, we need to do it to be selfish. Because we can never have an honest conversation about improving our communities if only a slither of the population is part of that conversation. And we can never have an honest conversation about the future of our communities if only a slither of the population is even being thought about in that conversation. That's why this idea of never giving up on our kids matters. Because you show me a kid who does not care about their own future, I will show you a kid that does not care about yours either. And that's a very dangerous place to be in. Thank you.
I have a question. You threw away a line about if we could ask you about what you're doing now with higher education. What are you doing now with higher education?
Thank you so much. I actually, so initially it really started off with conversations with the White House about what was happening with college completion. Because they were making a note that they were like, for the first time in recorded history last year, 80% of kids who started off in high school actually completed, which is a big deal when you consider the fact that the number two decades ago was 58%, right? So this is a massive jump that we have seen in a relatively short period of time of kids who are actually starting high school and actually completing high school. The thing, though, is the number when it comes to higher education, that number has not moved. In fact, it's actually gone lower. And so we're getting more kids across the high school finish line, but then when they hit college, there's this cliff that happens for so many kids. And unfortunately, what we're seeing with a lot of those kids is that cliff happens early. So for all kids that start college every single year, 34% of them will not finish their freshman year or will not re-enroll for their sophomore year. And so basically what that means is this. We've got a lot of kids who are then walking around with debt and no degree, which is arguably the most troubling of all the situations, right? And there's a few different reasons for it. One is the financial piece. It's the piece we were actually just talking about it earlier, when you have college education rising at a clip of 8 and 9% every single year, and wages not only just staying flat, but actually going down. So college becomes increasingly unaffordable, and even with the introduction of things like Pell Grants, GI Bill, GAG grants, et cetera, it's still becoming a very heavy cliff, a very high cliff for people to overdo. But ironically, for many of the kids that we're talking about, for many of the kids we work with, when you include a lot of the whether it be federal and or state aid, the financial situation is actually not the largest of the situation. So that does need to be addressed, but it's not the largest reason. The two largest reasons are these. One is the need for academic remediation. So the amount of kids who then finish high school when they go into college are still need remedial coursework. The challenge with remedial coursework is this, is that remedial coursework costs the same. So kids will go into college, they'll pay full tuition for courses that aren't worth anything. So what ends up happening is then you get a kid who at the end of the year has now paid whatever the tuition is, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $60,000, whatever your college tuition is now, and they have no credits. Or they have 3 credits. You show me that kid, I'm telling you, a better chance than not, that child will not graduate from college. And the reason they will not graduate college in many cases is because, A, by the time they get their sea legs under them, their financial aid clock has already started to run. So how much they will have to pay later on when they walk in, they say, my bill used to be $1,800, my bill is now $18,000. I think I'm going to find something else to do. And the third reason, and the largest reason, actually, is the social transition. Is we get kids who walk into a college campus and they either don't feel welcomed, they do not feel supported, and within months for many of them, they're gone. And unfortunately, if they're attending the wrong school, it'll be months before the school even notices that they're gone. So when we take all 3 of those reasons, and we begin to understand what's actually happening to so many students who are making this transition into higher ed, my basic thesis was, well, if we know that the choke point is the freshman year, then why don't we reinvent the freshman year?
completely change the structure of how the freshman year works and how the freshman year looks, so we can provide a softer on-ramp for students as they're going into this process of higher education. So what we then do is we then have partnered with institutions of higher education. Currently, right now, we're in Baltimore, partnering with the University of Baltimore, Community College of Baltimore County, and we're actually doing more schools within Maryland for next year. And the whole idea is what we want to do is the students are taking classes with their university partner, but they're taking no more than 2 classes at a time. And that's for 2 reasons. One is we want them to focus on mastery of the subject work and not necessarily regurgitation. And we want them also to be able to stay away from remedial coursework because they're taking core transferable classes. However, in addition to that, in addition to their coursework that they're taking with their university partners, we're also having them take assessments because we want to know where their skill sets actually match their interests. And then from there, we want to place them with internships and service learning opportunities in their areas of interests so they can get some kind of practical understanding of why they're there. Because for many kids, you know, we have colleges, who I won't mention, but where they won't let their kids do internships until their senior year. And my point is, isn't that kind of backwards? Like, I get the whole thing about we don't want to overburden them. I understand that. But again, it brings up the expectation argument, and B, it also brings up the argument of a distinct disadvantage, because 70% of jobs in this country do not happen through the classified ads or through Monster.com. 70% of jobs in this country happen because one day you will get a phone call or an email from somebody who says, you know what, I'm looking for someone that can do X, Y, or Z, and we have a mutual friend or your family member's a friend of mine, and they suggested that I contact you. Do you have some time to talk? 70% of jobs in this country happen because one day you will call up a friend or a mentor or a guidance counselor or a teacher or a college president or whoever, and you will say, I'm really looking to get into this field. Do you know anybody that does that? And they'll say, I know 3 people that do that. I'll put you guys in touch. That's the way this game works. So if we have students who are walking around with lower senses of social capital than everybody else, and then we're expecting them to compete with everyone else, that's not fair. And so what we then do is, in addition to the academic experiences, there's also internships and service learning experience they do, and then there's also a whole co-curriculum that we bring to the student. The co-curriculum will include everything from how are you properly filling out your FAFSA, which is another huge problem, to things like, you know, what is proper business attire? How do you address bosses versus colleagues versus subordinates? How do you manage your social media footprint so you're not putting things on Twitter and Facebook that will haunt you for the rest of your employment days? These are all things that we want all of our students to understand very early on in the collegiate process. So not only are they getting academic momentum, so all of our students will, you know, for all of our students, they can earn up to 30 transferable academic credits by the end of their freshman year. I always tell people, it's not an alternative to a freshman year. This is your freshman year. It's just a non-traditional way of doing it. But it's your freshman year because when you finish at the platform, you finish up as a sophomore. But in addition to that, it's all these other elements that we think become incredibly important because truthfully, many other kids are getting those things in different ways. And we have to be able to add those advances into multiple other platforms for every student to be able to benefit. So it's essentially taking the benefits of, Lisa and I were talking about a gap year, right? And the benefits of gap years. And so basically, for those who don't know, gap years are kind of the years after a student's senior year, where they just take a year. Oftentimes, they'll travel to another part of the world. They'll just do something else before they head on to college. The thing that really took me about gap years is how effective they are. Right? Students who do gap years generally don't change their majors often. They generally have higher GPAs. You know, I'm on the Rhodes Trust Commission, so every year we select a new crop of Rhodes Scholars. And of last year's class, half of the finalists who we interviewed did a gap year. Half. So we know these things work. However, here's the challenge. Gap years can also cost generally between $25,000 and $40,000 a year. You don't get academic credit for it. It's not personalized. And so I always laugh and say, you know, that's why I never heard of a gap year when I was coming out of high school. I wasn't a candidate. So basically what we want to try to do is take the advantages and the benefits of the gap year and democratize them. Have them so every single student can get the benefits. And in fact, in some ways, it's the enhanced benefits because they're actually getting academic momentum and credits. But at the same time, they're going to walk into their sophomore year of college with a much clearer understanding of who they are and what they want to do, and also with networks and connections to be able to build upon. That when they walk across that graduation stage, they're not just walking across with a degree and hopefully in 4 years, but they're also walking around with job offers and a better sense of where exactly I want to go. So that's the next big rock we're going to move. And I can be pretty persistent, and I don't plan on giving up until we actually get that rock moved. So, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a little bit shorter than this.
No, that's
So I feel like I'm regressing the conversation, and I apologize. As you're speaking, this is now my second time to get to hear you speak, and I appreciate it very much for the time that you've invested into teachers. Well, you were in Oklahoma last year when I saw you, and I
Yes.
appreciate that. And so as you're speaking, I'm sure that we as teachers, we do kind of to reflect on her question. As you're speaking, those faces of children pop into our minds where we think, I've said everything I can do, I've done everything I can do, and then we send them back into that environment of which you spoke, and it's so frustrating to us, but we can't give up, again, as you said. So to summarize all that I've been able to hear you say, but my students will never have that opportunity, or I say, are less likely to have that opportunity. If you had to summarize one thing to tell that kid who is at just a situation that I personally could never, fortunately, understand, what is the one thing that you feel that I could tell that kid and look him in the eye, because usually it's a him, and really make a change? Because I feel like I've said what I can, I've done what I can, we've partnered to do what we can, but it's still, something is missing. That mask is there. So what is the one phrase that you would encourage us to say to that child that could truly impact that child's life?
Thank you. And first, let me say, if y'all seriously, like, and be in touch, because I know, especially for some of the folks who are here, like, I'm very easy. So, like, my email is just wes@theotherwesmore.com, or if you hit me on Twitter or whatever, because
Yeah,
don't be surprised
I
if I show
tweeted
up.
to find out where you were going to be today.
Oh, you did? Oh,
That
yeah.
was me.
Sorry, okay. Well, don't be surprised if I show up at your door, because, I mean, this is something I'm genuinely passionate about. While I never think that there's going to be a single phrase that we can give to a child or anything, because I even think about my own life, right, where there were certain things that people said that didn't quite resonate with me or didn't hit me until later on. Or there was never like that, like that moment when, like, everything made sense for me. Because I'm to be honest, like, my life even to this day is like a series of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or, you know, 2 steps back and 1 step forward sometimes. You know what I'm saying? So there's never that moment when it all makes sense and it's all right. But I think there is something that does become important, though. It's they need to have a sense of where they want their lives to go. Because one of my big pet peeves, and I know I've spoken to Joe about this, but one of my big pet peeves is oftentimes when you'll see, like, you know, celebrities or whatever like that, and they'll get an Oscar, they'll get a Grammy or whatever, and then, like, Ryan Seacrest or whoever will run up to them. Like, could you ever have imagined yourself this happening? And he puts the mic in their face. And then they flick their hair, and it's like, I could have never have imagined this. This is so unexpected. I'm just so shocked. I'm just so la la la. And every time I see it, I think to myself, you're lying. You're lying. Because it's impossible for that to be true. Literally impossible. Now, I'm not saying when they were 5 years old, they saw themselves winning a Grammy. Or when they were 10 years old, they saw themselves winning an Oscar. But I can guarantee you, whatever it was, 6 months ago, they were standing there in their bathroom mirror, holding their bottle of Pert shampoo, thanking the fans and thanking the Academy. Because, I think about it, I think actually, it's military training, right? Because there's something in the military, in infantry school, where they say, you cannot hit a target that you can't see. And the whole point of the way they express to us in the military is, you need to have eyes on an objective. If you don't have eyes on an objective, you cannot take down a target, right? How is life different? You cannot hit a target that you can't see. And so oftentimes when people will say, could you have imagined your, book being used in high schools and colleges? Could you have imagined your work doing that? Could you have imagined working with dozens of students, helping them to get through college? Yeah, I did. I did imagine it. And I'll never fake it. And, I never have imagined. No, yeah, I did see it. And that's why it's happening. Because that's the only way it's going to happen. And life, in my opinion, and I would share with the students, life has a really nasty and cynical sense of humor for those who don't have a direction with where they want their life to go. I mean, life can be really unforgiving for those. So if you do not have a vision for for where you want your life to go, then good luck. Then good luck. And so again, there's never going to be a single thing. But I think that becomes crucial for all people, for all young people, to understand that. They've got to have a sense of vision as to where they want their lives to go. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I have this conversation on an ongoing basis with my assistant principal, who the two of us started teaching together, okay? So he's an African-American male. We've both been teaching in the same district for 27 years. High poverty, high drugs, high crime. That's our daily struggle with the kids we're working with, is they don't see that potential. And it's not something that you can give to them. I had a kid tell me one time, 8 years old, that his aspiration was actually to end up in jail because he would have 3 square meals a day and a place to sleep, and that's where his brother was 8 years old. Like, how do you help instill that desire for something more and the knowledge that you have that they can succeed in somebody else?
Thank you very much. And and first, being clear, and there's, especially with this group and this audience, is no doubt that this stuff is not easy, right? There's never going to be a single, like, oh, you just do this and then they'll be fine. We all know that that's not the case, and that's not the truth. The other thing that I do know, though, is this, is the most important thing that we can then frame out to that student is a level of consistency. Because just like for all of us, if we hear certain things once, we'll forget it. If we hear it twice, we'll forget it. If we hear it repeatedly, it becomes like a sense of muscle memory, where then it starts mattering and then it starts actually meaning something. And it also depends, and even, because even when people make the argument where it's like, well, am I the right person to tell it to them? I'm not from their neighborhood. I don't look like them. I didn't come from the same family circumstances that they're coming from. So when they're hearing it from me, they're looking at me like, what do you know? You don't know what I'm going through. You don't know what it's like to not eat all weekend. You don't know what it's like to watch your uncle shot. And it becomes this sense where we're like, well, what am I supposed to say then? I know I want to help, I know I want to support, but can I even break through of that just initial facade? And the answer that I give to that is this: if you show me a person who is willing to be consistent, I will take you 10 times out of 10 versus a person who looks just like that kid, or that person who grew up around the corner from that kid, who when they say they'll be there at Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and at Tuesday at 10 o'clock, they are nowhere to be found. Because that's what builds up that shell. That belief in this idea that it doesn't matter to anyone else what I do. You want to show them the things that should break their heart, breaks your heart too. You want to show them that your passion and your love for them is as sincere and as heartfelt as the passion and love that you have for your own kids and your own family members. That's how passionate you are about them. Because to be honest, kids respond to that. I know I responded to it. We have these kids have these unbelievable sensors, right? They can sense who's serious and who's not. They figured out in the first 5 minutes if this person cares at all about me. And I'm not saying that there is a switch that automatically goes off. I'm not saying it'll happen overnight. I know there are some people who I'm just very disappointed in my actions when I was coming up, because I know I hurt and I disappointed people who did not deserve to be hurt nor disappointed. Physically, emotionally, hurt people who did nothing wrong and who loved me. And I'm sorry for it. I also know that what people were saying to me, whether it happened on the timeline that they wanted it to happen on or not, I hear them. I've never forgotten them. I've never forgotten the ones who never allowed me to give up on myself. Might have not have taken days, might not have taken hours, might not have taken weeks, might have taken a bit longer than that. But I know those are the ones that I remember, and those are the ones that I'll never forget, and those are the ones that I still think about. So it's not going to be an overnight thing. There's not going to be a simple solution. And anyone who tells you there is a simple solution, or hey, if you buy this product, the solution's there, they're lying to you. But I do know that consistency matters more than anything else. And I have seen it, and I have felt it, and it's a thing that actually does break through. Because all the other things, if consistency isn't there, that becomes just as much a facade as anything else. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually just have a comment. Something you said that really resonated with me was your level of expectation for yourself. And I'm a product of Northeast Washington, D.C. project, and I knew what was around me. I knew what I saw every day. I knew that I didn't want to be an unwed teenage mom. I knew that I didn't want to end up on drugs. I knew that that I wanted to have a purpose. But if it hadn't been for my mom, who raised 5 of us by herself, and just continuing to instill in me that I could be more, I wouldn't have been more. And I remember having the expectation of just wanting to go to college. And we didn't have the money. I'm sorry. But I made it through college. I worked and paid my way through college. And I remember all I wanted was a bachelor's degree. My mom is deceased now, but I have 2 master's degrees. Expectation is huge. It is so huge. It just, nothing beats that. Every day I try to instill in my students what I expect of them. I'm always saying what I expect of them. I had no idea you want to say something about expectations. But I expect, because people expect this stuff from me. Yeah, it works. It works.
Oh, you're gonna make us all cry now, man. No, but it matters because it's people, whether they realize it or not, they internalize this. They know if the person standing in front of them expects anything of them or not. And their actions will reflect, and it becomes something that we not only fight for and we embrace, but we hold on to with everything in it. Like you said, when you're almost like, listen, your bar is so high, you take that seriously. That means something to you. I think, I don't know if any of y'all that study or teach psychology now, but like in psychology, there's this term called the imposter syndrome. Now we heard the imposter syndrome is basically this. It's this idea, and it's a clinical diagnosis, but it's this idea where you feel like no matter what room you're in, you don't belong there. And you always feel like an imposter. Like you're always waiting for someone to tap you on the shoulder and say, what are you doing here? And you kind of then go about your life with that as your frame. And I think there were real elements where I was kind of under this imposter syndrome, where you're kind of like waiting for someone to tap you and say, why are you still here? Like, it's like I've had a nice run, but my runway is running up real quick. And
I think when I hear your story, it really makes me think of that because you don't have any imposter syndrome. And your mom made sure you don't have any imposter syndrome. There is never a room that you're in that you don't belong in. I know everywhere I go, I'm not there because of someone's benevolence. I'm not there because of some social experiment. I'm not there because someone wants to diversify a room. I'm not there for any of that stuff. I'm there because I belong. And if I'm not using my voice, then what's the point of me being there? If I'm not using and thinking and internalizing all of my history, all of my experiences, all that kind of stuff, and how I think about the world, then what is my point? There is no imposter syndrome in you. And I think part of the importance and part of the beauty of the work that you're doing with your students is helping them to know there's no imposter syndrome in them either. No one is going to tap you on the shoulder and say, what are you doing here? Because you belong in every single room that you walk into. I don't care if you're walking down your block, and I don't care if you're walking into the Situation Room in the White House. You belong there. That's why you're there. Now that you're there, do something with it. And don't just get that bachelor's. Go get your master's and your master's and go get all of it. Because that's where you belong. And that's, I think, what your mom instilled in you. What my mom instilled in me. What so many people, guardians, family members, etc., instilled in all of us. That's just the same lessons we're trying to instill in the students that we work with. So, bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I know I'm being very sincere when I say, so seriously, my email address, honestly, is just wes@theotherwesmore.com. That's the easiest one. That goes directly to me. My Twitter is Wesmore1, and I do follow. Who asked about the Twitter account from Oklahoma? Okay, yes. So I am good about that, and I'll get back to it. But I just can't tell you how thankful again I am for each and every one of you. You're lifesavers, and not in like this cynical or snarky term. You're lifesavers, because I had so many of those lifesavers in my life. So thank you for what you do, and if I ever can be helpful or supportive to the work that you do, please let me know, because I would love and be honored to be a wingman. Oh, sorry, yes, ma'am.
Can I just, two things?
Yeah,
One, I want to thank you, because I think as educators, the thing for me that's really difficult is remembering the kids who, I teach middle school. So kids come back years later, you know, you were the only person who did this for me, or you're the only person. And in the midst of it, it feels like, you're not hearing me, you're not listening to me, you're not. And I think it's so hard for us to focus on those kids who we are reaching because we don't see it until later. And it's so hard when, I've had a really rough year. I've had 3 young men, African-American young men, who've been incarcerated this year. They're high schoolers now. I had them, I think, one 4 years ago and one 3 years ago. And they'll be behind bars for a long time. And it is hard to do that. What more could we have done? And I think that sometimes gets in the way of us doing or putting ourselves out there, because it's so hard when that happens. So I just want to thank you for, 1, acknowledging how hard it is, and 2, giving us hope that there's not an end point. We're not going to feel like, oh, we've accomplished everything we're supposed to accomplish. And I think it was just really heartening to hear that we got to keep going. We just got to pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, try the next day, keep with the message, be consistent, and do all those things that we know we can do, knowing that sometimes it's not going to work out the way we want it to. So I really, really appreciate that. And the other thing is, I'm thinking about my particularly my boys, but also my girls. Do you do, and forgive me if you already do this and I just am unaware, but are there any kinds of video resources that teachers like me, because I am a middle-aged white woman, and I actually start my class with that in the fall and say, you know, we have more in common than you think right now, but if you let me run things according to what interests me, I guarantee you what interests me as a middle-aged white woman is not what interests you. You know, so we're really upfront about that, but I do think there's a voice where, like I think you alluded to it earlier, when you see someone who looks like you, when you see someone who came from a circumstance like you, when you see some parallels in someone who's achieved something rather than just me saying, I know it can happen. I think you have a voice and a persona that would really be so meaningful to so many African American kids, and it just seems that they're so engaged in a video kind of way that that's one way that I just see you as being an amazing resource to all of us. So thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you for everything you do. You know, we don't. Yeah, I'd say I think I have a new project now. No, but you know, and I really do appreciate it. And actually, like I said, you know, one of my real passion points, and I try to get, because I really enjoy seeing students and working with students and doing that kind of work. And I do understand and agree with you on the fact that kids also need to see. They need to see what they can actually be as well, and that does matter. And I wasn't trying to downplay it when I talked about before. Where it's like, you know, how consistency matters, because I still believe more than anything consistency is the number one thing that we can give kids, not necessarily someone who looks just like them. But truthfully, when I think about that stuff that does matter, and I think about even in my own life, you who are doing the work every single day, that is what is going to move that needle in that child's life. You know, there are things and resources and supplies that can absolutely be introduced, and I would love to be able to, you know, to explore and get things in there. I know that, like, for example, there's, you know, I've been very humbled that, like, for example, with the other Wes Moore, or with Discovering Wes Moore, the young adult book, that it's been made part of curriculum in school systems. That they have, you know, they have service projects tied up and aligned to it. You know, one of the things I love is that classes will oftentimes send letters. We'll write, as part of an assignment, we'll send letters to myself and Wes, and we actually will respond to all of them. And Wes, and I tell you, Wes is like a machine. He responds to every single letter that is sent to him. And when I asked him, I was like, you know, so why? He kind of jokes and he says, well, what else do I have to do? But I mean, because I say that kind of in jest, but I say I want to be very clear. You know, in no way is this like creating revisionist history or creating apologists for Wes nor his actions, right? I mean, again, he is in year 14 of a life sentence, and I never want to lose sight of that. But I also do know that whatever we can do to help young people who are at this point where they're making decisions that really do start forking, whatever we can do to kind of help with that process, I know it's something that becomes incredibly important in that. So, thank you. But again, you know, please, I would love to be able to stay in touch, figure out how I can be supportive and helpful, and I'm just thankful to all of you for what you do. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.